Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
And I come back to you now, at the turn of the tide.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten.
And I'm Chad Gross.
And we're looking forward to today's interview with a returning guest, Justin Brierley. And you may remember in episode 108, we talked to Justin about his book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. Well, it wasn't too long after that interview where we found out that Justin moved on to other things beyond the Unbelievable radio program. So we'll be talking to him a bit about that today. But also his newly released book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. What did you think of this book, Chad?
I actually really enjoyed it. I thought that it gave a really good overview of the new atheism, what it did well, what it didn't do so well, and what was kind of birthed out of it, which was surprising because what was birthed out of it was a new interest in finding meaning, interest in theism, and interest in Christianity. And so when I first started reading it, I have to be honest, when I saw it had the new atheism history in it, I was a little discouraged because I thought, oh gosh, the new atheism, they're so old and their arguments are so bad. Sorry, but they are. But it really served his purpose to show what was birthed from the new atheism. And so I really enjoyed it, and it covered some ground that I thought was fresh, particularly his take on determinism was very interesting. And I thought it really was a nice compliment to his first book that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I would want to make clear to listeners that this isn't a book about the new atheism. It's more of like how over the past 10 years, say 10, 15 years, since the rise of the new atheism, that caused like a real interest in the God conversation. And where there wasn't a huge interest in apologetics, it caused like a rebound and a huge growth in the apologetics. Lots of new books, lots of new people going into philosophy of religion, Christian philosophy, a real interest in arguments and discussions and conversations for Christianity. So it's in that aspect, the history of the new atheism was, we're going to take a shot at Christianity and theism, and it's going to totally backfire. The movement will disintegrate and become pretty much old news, while in its wake, you've got a resurgence of Christian apologetics, a change in people's interests. And, it's sort of like Justin's arguing that we're poised for the metaphor he uses in the book is a turning of the tide, where the tide sort of went out and now it's like getting ready to come back in because there's a rising interest in the God conversation, in Christianity, and belief systems that actually bring true meaning and that are relevant to people's lives. So it was really interesting to hear his insights about the new atheism, and because it was like a bunch of stuff I hadn't even heard about because I kind of tuned out after a while when it, with like the four horsemen of the new atheism, when it started disintegrating, I just kind of like tuned out and moved on to other things. But yeah, I didn't realize how it kind of crumbled away and there was infighting and all of that sort of thing. So that was really kind of an interesting part of the book too.
Yeah, and something the book got me thinking about, and I hope I can articulate this well, is that one of the phenomenons that's happened since the new atheism is that people who were initially swayed by their arguments and their brand of rhetoric were starting to see that when they hear intelligent Christians and good arguments for the existence of God, that some of these people actually feel kind of duped. They begin to see that they weren't necessarily presented a fair view of Christianity, and it kind of reignites their interest in God and their interest in Christianity. And I think that's an important lesson for us as Christians, is that we want to make sure we're presenting the best arguments and evidences so that when people hear critiques of Christianity, this is not something that is surprising to them or that they're not prepared to hear. And so I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. Good to have him back and find out as well what he's up to these days. Now, listener, just want to ask for your help. If you haven't yet reviewed the show in iTunes, the podcast in iTunes or your podcast player, leave a fresh 5-star review. Those are the only ones allowed, of course. But we'd appreciate that just to kind of breathe some life into the reviewosphere. Because some of the reviews are kind of old, and we know there's a lot of listeners out there, at least 10 to 20. So let's get on to the interview.
Switch me on. Let's get ready.
Well, Justin Brierley, thanks for joining us again for the podcast.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you both. Thanks for having me back on so soon.
Absolutely.
Well, we had to because you just released another book, and after we read your other one, which had been out for a while. But no, we really enjoyed it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you've moved on from your unbelievable podcast program. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days.
Yeah, well, I mean, just going back to kind of moving on from Unbelievable, it was a very bittersweet goodbye, just because, I'd been doing the show for over 17 years, believe it or not. And it had obviously become, some significant in its way in the world of Christian apologetics. So yeah, it was a big deal to move on. But I did feel that there was a calling there to start to explore some new projects, some fresh collaborations, and that was just going to be easiest to do sort of in my own capacity. So I've been doing a number of different things. I have been doing some new podcasts. So one called Re-Enchanting that's filmed at Lambeth Palace Library in London. It's a lovely location to do it. It looks out over the Houses of Parliament, and it's really aimed at talking to all kinds of interesting people, both Christian and non-Christian, about what we can do to re-enchant the secular world with the Christian worldview. So that's the Re-Enchanting podcast. I've been guest hosting for the Maybe God podcast as well. That's run out of a church called the Story Church in Houston, and does sort of, stuff that I find interesting. A number of bits of speaking, writing, and at the moment, talking a lot about this new book that's just been released, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And on top of that, trying to put together a sort of podcast documentary series based on the book. So that's all keeping me busy at the moment.
So you defeated the new atheism, and now you've moved on. That's very good. Now, about the book, Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. Yeah, real enjoyable. And Chad and I were talking prior to you coming in to our studio here. We were talking about how that sort of introduction chapter with the history of the rise of the new atheism and how it kind of petered out and disintegrated, in, for lack of better terms. That was really interesting. Talk a little bit about how you see the positive role that actually new atheism played in a sense of rekindling sort of engagement with apologetics and things like that. And then where did it go off the rails?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the new atheism, when it arose in the mid-2000s, was actually quite helpful, ironically, for the church in some ways, because I think it really did force the church to go and pick up its history, theology, apologetics books again. I think perhaps to some extent, especially in the UK and perhaps other parts of the Western church, it had become rather maudlin. There was a sort of, increasingly there'd been a sort of experiential kind of approach to Christianity, almost a sentimental one in some ways. And I think that having to go and defend your beliefs against these quite aggressive atheists that were coming on the scene actually was probably quite a good thing in some ways, because it meant that they had to sort of up their game. Churches had to go sort of, go back to the basics in that way. Mm-hmm. So I was, in the sense at the forefront of that, in the middle of that with the Unbelievable show. And it was a great opportunity. I think for me, I really benefited a great deal from being part of those debates and actually coming away in the end with a much stronger faith. So that, I think, is the way in which it was a benefit.
Mm-hmm. How long has your book been in the works? Because, you're drawing on a lot of different insights that you've gained over the past 17, 18 years with the Unbelievable program, sort of your observation of how the landscape has changed. And you've also used a metaphor in the book about the tide sort of going out and, it's going to come back in. So what brought about the book? What was the sort of impetus behind that? And what's your overall argument in the book?
Well, the book kind of, has been a work in progress for a few years. And initially I was going to do a book following up to my first book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. I had in mind a kind of doing a book about conversion stories, perhaps drawing out sort of, the apologetic lessons in each story. But when I kind of ran this past a publisher, it was what I'd said about the way the conversation had changed and the way that I thought the new atheism had effectively sort of died off and been replaced by a new conversation with some interesting secular intellectuals. And they said to me, actually, I think that sounds like a really interesting book. So that kind of put me in mind to actually maybe change the focus. And I did. And The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is the result, because I had been seeing a real change in the last several years of hosting the Unbelievable show from those kind of bombastic kind of debates between the new atheists and Christian thinkers into something a little bit more nuanced. I'd noticed that, a lot more people were distancing themselves from new atheism, secular people. And I noticed that a lot of those secular people were not trashing or dismissing Christianity as readily as some of those new atheists did. In fact, a number of them seemed almost wistful about it, rather wanted it to be true and were worried about the direction of society and culture in the absence of the Christian story. So I was particularly noticing this sort of when for instance, I had the well-known Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson on the show, who, rose to become, a very big sort of star in his circles. And just the way in which he, even as a non-Christian, was nonetheless drawing lots of these young men and basically telling them, you need to go back to the Bible to understand kind of what life is for and, how to achieve meaning and purpose in life. And it was fascinating seeing some people like him coming out of the woodwork and almost replacing the new atheists. I mean, I could go into detail as to why the new atheist sort of project failed ultimately, but you mentioned the tide thing, and there is this sort of analogy that I draw throughout the book of the turning of the tide and the sea of faith coming back in again. That's from quite a well-known poem by Matthew Arnold, a Victorian poet, who wrote this poem, Dover Beach, which talked about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, which, in his generation 150 years ago, he saw this sort of secularism sweeping in, the belief, religion, God being sort of driven out, that sea of faith going out. But I had a conversation, again, a few years ago with Douglas Murray. Now, Douglas Murray is quite a well-known cultural thinker. He's not a Christian, but he describes himself as a Christian atheist, someone who appreciates the value of Christianity and what it has done for the West, and actually doesn't think atheism can provide that kind of meaning and purpose. And he said to me, speaking of seeing some of his contemporary peers and intellectuals coming back to faith or coming to faith for the first time, he said the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is that it doesn't only go out, it could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And it made me wonder, well, maybe we might be starting to see that. As I say, because I'd noticed this new atheism thing kind of sputtering out eventually, because I'd noticed this influx of new thinkers taking Christianity seriously again, kind of opening the door for a lot of people to take it seriously. And I'd be noticing a lot of interesting, surprising stories of people finding faith. And I just thought all of this together feels like it could be something which I have put the label on of the surprising rebirth of belief in God. This, perhaps we're just starting to see that tide turn and people might be opening up to the possibility of it again. So that's kind of, where the impetus of the book came from.
Yeah, it's as if the people who are against Christianity were like, oh, we don't want Christianity, it's bad. And then, oops, I think of when we get rid of Christianity, we have some things even worse with certain cultural insanity. You've got Jordan Peterson, as you mentioned, who sees the value of the Christian story, and really a lot of his talks are around that. Well, you also mentioned Peter Boghossian, the author of A Manual for Creating Atheists. He was really against Christianity, but now you talk about how he's sort of teamed up with Christians. So what's the reason and the significance for that?
Well, his story, again, is one of many fascinating ones. I tell it a bit in the book, but I first had Peter Boghossian on the Unbelievable show, I think in 2014, and he had recently written this book you mentioned, A Manual for Creating Atheists. He was very much on team New Atheist at the time. This was his, as the title of the book suggests, a kind of manual for talking people of faith out of their religious delusions. He, when he came on the show to debate it with Tim McGrew, he basically likened faith to a sort of delusional sort of illness. And that was kind of where he stood on those sorts of things. Well, fast forward 4 or 5 years later, I was setting up a sort of live discussion event in Portland where he was a professor of philosophy. And I reached out to him to see if he'd come on as the atheist person. And he sent me this most surprising email where he basically said, Justin, I'm going to politely decline your invitation, though I would love to meet up with you if time allowed. He said, the reason is that I'm not debating religion anymore. I'm not interested in doing that. In fact, I see many religious people and Christians as more my bedfellows, my allies at this point than my foes. And he said, I've really turned my attention to fighting a far more sinister sort of thing. And what it turned out that he and some fellow colleagues were doing was actually preparing a number of hoax papers that they'd been submitting to peer-reviewed journals, essentially sending up and satirizing the so-called grievance studies that they were very worried by. These were kind of politically correct ideologies that were essentially being sort of put into all kind of mainstream academic subjects. And as long as you said the right thing and used the correct sort of politically correct ideology, you could more or less say anything. And so they were sort of creating these hoax papers, which were being accepted and published until they were finally rumbled, this ruse. And it created quite a controversy at the time. And it was their kind of protest, really, at what they saw as this sort of politically correct ideology that was cancelling free speech on campus, that was sort of effectively, not an academic pursuit, but was just this particular political movement. And so that became their new bête noire, that became their enemy. In a way, it was still a kind of quasi-religious thing they were reacting against. That's very much what they came to see. And as you said, Brian, that question of, well, what replaces the new atheism? I think Peter Boghossian especially has come to realize that actually the new atheism, by trying to kind of tug the Christian story away, may have simply left the floor open to all kinds of other quasi-religious stories to come in. And these ones were hitting far closer to home in academia. And to that extent, it's so interesting to see the way that he and many others from those, if you like, former new atheists have completely changed sides, not becoming Christians per se, but the battles that they're fighting are completely different ones now. None of them are now really engaging with institutional religion. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or, any of them sort of really having much to say about religion at this point, even though they publish those best-selling books. They're all fighting the culture wars now. And because they've realized that this much, much worse enemy, as far as they're concerned, is now at their doorstep. And so it's fascinating to see that the way the culture has changed in that respect.
So it's a really interesting book, Justin. We enjoyed it. And one thing that was really interesting about it, too, is that, some apologetics books, they might start and not say this is like a strictly apologetics book, but it's how can it not be at the same time? It's sort of a observation about culture, a memoir of sorts, but then you've got apologetics arguments and testimonies and things like that. Really cool sort of combination of factors. But talk a little bit about how you composed the book and what your intention was in that sort of format, and then maybe we'll unpack a few of the details.
Yeah, I mean, my first book, my Unbelievable Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian, was kind of more your standard sort of apologetics book, because it really did start with sort of 3 chapters arguing for God, and then I moved on to the case for Jesus and the resurrection, dealt with the problem of suffering, and so on. So kind of that's kind of the order you might expect. I think with this one, what's different is it's actually talking about a cultural form of apologetics, really, and therefore I wasn't so concerned with sort of laying out a sort of just a typical set of apologetics arguments. I wanted to look at what was going on. Starting with this rise and fall of new atheism, kind of looking at what happened there, and then looking at the rise of these new, interesting secular thinkers who seem to be advocating for Christianity in a strange way. And from there, kind of having looked at the culture and the way that that's shifted, I then sort of wanted to look at various spheres of academia and culture where I've seen the conversation changing, basically, away from this materialist atheism that the new atheists were advocating towards a far more open sort of attitude towards the possibility of something like God. Now, not everyone that I talk about in the book kind of names it God, but you don't have to kind of use your imagination too much to see that what they're talking about is something that is clearly not atheist materialism, and clearly is something that looks like a divine mind or some kind of purpose behind the universe. So, for instance, after sort of talking about the rise of these new thinkers in culture, I do a chapter looking at history and and why the fact that we're suddenly seeing quite a number of people coming out saying, hey, we didn't get our Western culture and morality sort of from science or atheism, and we didn't get it from the ancient Greeks or Romans. This is something that, for instance, Tom Holland, a well-known historian here in the UK, fantastically popular podcaster and author of a book called Dominion, he's been saying this for a number of years now. And he, even himself, as someone who doesn't necessarily call himself a Christian, has been saying, in almost every way, you, all of us are actually Christians in the way that we actually act, that our moral instincts, they're basically bred of the Christian story. That's the revolution that gave us, the way we think about life, and saying to his fellow secularists and humanists, look, you're as theological as most Christians because you believe in things like human rights, which you have absolutely no reason to believe in on a purely secular basis. They have come from this thing called the Christian story. So he's a fascinating character. So I do a chapter, dealing with the historical sort of stuff. And yes, it is in itself a sort of apologetic argument, because I think actually it's not just that you can make a case that history has informed, Christian history has informed our morality. I think you also need to ask, well, do you need a God to make sense of morality full stop, Then I move on to talking about the Bible and the way that again has had a huge cultural impact, and the way that many thinkers, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, Jonathan Haidt, and many others are again going back to ancient wisdom as they ask, how do we make sense of the sort of meaning crisis that's engulfing our culture? And they're suddenly pointing people back towards this source of ancient wisdom. Again, I go on and sort of make an apologetic argument for why it's not just good psychological wisdom that's in there, but actually the reason it's worked is because it's true, and there are reasons why you can believe the stuff that's in there, the historical reliability of those texts and so on. And then I go through science as well, the history of science, and the fact that obviously new atheism spun its own tale, its own narrative about science versus faith, but just busting some of those myths, hopefully, and then talking about, again, some of these new secular intellectuals, people like Paul Davies, who are kind of coming to very interesting conclusions about the nature of the universe and why it produced us, and saying it can't just be down to some random materialistic, naturalistic process. Likewise, even people who, you may think of as sort of fairly hardened atheists like Sir Roger Penrose, when you actually get him into a conversation with William Lane Craig, as I have, he comes out with all kinds of interesting, surprising things that don't sound at all atheist, like the fact that he believes there's three realms of reality, the physical realm, but also a realm of consciousness and a realm of mathematics. So he's not a naturalist by definition, because if he was, he would only believe in one of those realms, the natural realm. He believes there are three realms, and that in some fantastically crazy way, they all overlap and they all intermingle in incredibly specific ways. And again, you don't have to use your imagination too much to see that there could be something behind that there's a sort of, so I'm going on at length here, but each chapter deals with another thing. I also deal with philosophy, consciousness, and finally kind of putting it all together in why I think all these stories are pointing to the big story. So I'm trying to do apologetics, but more at a kind of level of looking at what's happening in the culture and saying, what's this all pointing towards? And ultimately, it is all, in my mind, pointing to God.
Yeah, and going back to Penrose, I think, if memory serves me correct, in that discussion, I think Craig even suggested to Penrose that those three spheres could be grounded in God. Is that correct?
Yeah. Effectively said, well, what about if you grounded them all in the mental sphere? Because so basically it was this sort of material sphere, this mental sphere, and this sphere of sort of abstract sort of concepts, like mathematics. And yeah, he suggested, well, what if the solution to your conundrum, Roger, is that there is a mind that kind of holds all of these spheres together? That seemed he said to Craig, felt that was a very plausible way of reconciling these things and not having to just hold it as an eternal mystery sort of thing, as Roger Penrose seems to. He sort of didn't want to say yes to that, but he did say after the interview, after the mics had gone off, it was a fascinating kind of way of doing things. So who knows whether it might have, moved him slightly the dial for him on the God question. I think, like so many people, the thing is with Roger Penrose and people like Paul Davies and others, they're not satisfied with materialist naturalism, but they don't really like traditional religion either. So they kind of want to keep God at arm's length, I think. They don't like the word God, frankly. And so even though so many of the things they say and, the conclusions they come to seem very God and Christian friendly, they tend to sort of wobble at the point of actually saying the word, if you like.
So, Justin, I'm curious. I know that your book, which as we've already said, I really enjoyed. I know that your book deals mainly with academics and how the secular academics have begun to take God seriously in various ways. One of the things that's interesting, though, and this, you don't deal directly with this in the book, but I think you'll see how it connects, is that on social media, you still have a good bit of kind of that new atheist attitude. Do you see social media and some of those venues kind of catching up eventually as more and more of these secular thinkers begin to take Christianity and the Bible seriously? Or what do you think?
I think there is a trickle-down effect. And the reality is, yes, of course, new atheism hasn't gone away completely. You can still find lots of corners of the internet with that kind of thinking. And you only have to sort of make an argument on Twitter or
I was going to say, I think they're all on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I just posted something today and have had an avalanche of responses. So there's still plenty of new atheism out there. I would say things are changing at that kind of public level. I would say just as a cultural phenomenon, it's very passé now. It's not the new atheists and the topics they were kind of banging on about aren't kind of, featuring on the front page of Time anymore or anything like that. And it's sort of, like I said, most of their key spokespeople have gone off and are doing other things now and have, they're just not as concerned as they were about religion. They've got these other concerns to deal with. And I think that, yes, I do see this movement of secular intellectuals who are genuinely asking interesting questions. And although that doesn't mean that kind of everyone's converted to faith and that all the new atheists who are still hanging around on Twitter have converted by any stretch.
Sure.
There are still a lot more people that I'm bumping into, whether it be in the comments in YouTube or, on Facebook or whatever, who just are the kinds of people who were probably 10, 15 years ago would have been listening to Sam Harris and Dawkins talking about God in that way. But now they're listening to, Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray and Jonathan Haidt and others. And it's just cracked the door open for them. So, and of course, there are people who have gone the whole hog, people who would say, absolutely, I'm a Christian now because Jordan Peterson kind of made it intellectually possible for me to start investigating it. And when I did, I went down that rabbit hole and here I am. I know several people who have that story. So for me, there is something happening. It's not at the level of a kind of a rushing tide coming back in now, but I do think we might be, as I say, to use that analogy again, we might just be seeing the turning of the tide. It might be that the materialist story is kind of just about reaching its furthest ebb. And who knows what the future could look like. And I suppose my hope and prayer is that, yes, it will even reach the people in my comments on Twitter at some point. But who knows? We'll see.
Oh, that would be great. So one of the sections in the book is you talk about the Bible and you talk about some of the reasons that the Bible is beginning to be taken seriously or considered once again. And so I was curious if you would be willing just to map out a couple of those reasons as to why the Bible can be taken seriously and even, as you said earlier in the interview, taken as historical.
Yeah, I do think actually it's interesting. Firstly, I think one of the reasons why is simply that people, as I say, in those cultural and intellectual spheres are beginning to take it seriously again. So the main people I'm hearing from, at least when it comes to the Bible, are no longer Richard Dawkins kind of accusing the Old Testament God of being a pestilential, filicidal maniac and so on. I'm hearing more often people like Jordan Peterson doing like sold out lectures on the book of Genesis or Exodus and reaching for these deep sort of wells of psychological wisdom in these books. And I'm seeing other people, who are talking about the Bible in very different ways. I mean, the fact is, even Richard Dawkins, even, in his, full on new atheist phase, was still aware that the Bible was a repository of an immense amount of, at the very least, idiom and literature that, we've been blessed to have in the Western world. He actually helped to fund a campaign to get the King James Bible into every school in the country just because of its pure literary value. So at least he recognized that. And I think more and more people are kind of coming to realize that actually simply dismissing the Bible as a lot of fairy tales and Bronze Age peasant stories isn't enough because it doesn't do justice to the way in which it has shaped the foundations. So I think you've got people like, for instance, Tom Holland also helping to do that, because they've been sort of talking about the Bible in very different terms to the new atheists as well. But then I think you've also got, going alongside that kind of newfound respect, if you like, for the Bible, you've got just a wonderful flourishing of scholarship in the last 20, 30 years in biblical studies, where you're getting some amazing new finds. Both you've got, new archaeological finds practically every month in Israel, which are kind of constantly coming up with all kinds of interesting ways to validate both Old and New Testament. And you've got people like Richard Borkham, who I know I had on my Unbelievable show a few times over the years, who I think has just sort of remapped the territory in biblical scholarship around the reliability of the New Testament, the eyewitness testimony in the Gospels, that kind of thing. And then people kind of taking that up and applying it in all kinds of interesting ways. Peter J. Williams, he had this excellent book out a couple of years ago on why we should be able to trust the New Testament. I've seen great work from people like Lydia McGrew as well, who are just coming up with interesting new ways of looking at the correlations and corroboration in between the different accounts in Scripture and so on. And I just see lots of really helpful ways in which the people are increasingly showing that the Bible can be trusted simply as a historical document. And for me, when you add that to this kind of new respect that's kind of coming out of these more intellectual circles as well, it feels like there's the potential there for people to really take the Bible seriously again. And I find that quite exciting. I talk in the book about the conversion of someone I know, James Orr, who is now a sort of professor of theology at Cambridge University, but we were actually contemporaries at Oxford University. And he has an amazing story of himself coming to faith sort of shortly after university, because he studied classics, he knew how to read ancient Greek. And so for the first time while at university, he read the Gospels in their original language. And it just bowled him over that these could be taken seriously as historical texts, just like all of the other things on his reading list. And that led to a process where he actually came to realize that this was more than just a historically reliable text. There was someone in this who was speaking to him. And I've seen that story happening more and more recently. One that I only sort of really found out about after I'd sort of sent the book for publishing was a woman that I've recently had the pleasure of interviewing a couple of times, Molly Worthen. Interestingly, she's a professor of history at the University of North Carolina. She's in the same department basically as Bart Ehrman of all people, but she has had this extraordinary conversion to Christianity, having sort of been an agnostic for a couple of decades really, reporting on religion in North America for places like the Washington Post and New York Times and The Atlantic. She was challenged basically in a piece she was doing on J.D. Greer, at the time the head of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he basically told her, Molly, why don't you go and actually look at whether this stuff could be true historically? That led her on a journey, which put her in touch with N.T. Wright. They were emailing back and forth, Tim Keller as well. I guess she had access to some interesting people. And she became a Christian. She got baptized last year. So when I see kind of super intelligent people like that being convinced on the basis of the Bible's historicity, and I see like super intelligent people talking about the Bible, that we need to take it seriously as this source of ancient wisdom, something exciting for me is happening in that sphere. And so that's kind of where I go in that chapter.
I was wondering what you would think about, and this pertains, I think, to what you talk about in the book about as far as presenting some of the evidence that has made these thinkers reconsider Christianity. I was listening recently to your old show, Unbelievable, and Alex O'Connor was on there with Alistair McGrath, and they were talking about the new atheism and a book that's just come out, sharing these different testimonies of people who actually kind of came to faith through reading Dawkins. Interesting.
I've actually had a chance to read it. It's really good. And I went to the book launch only a couple of days ago.
Oh, okay.
So,
Excellent.
Very good book. Yeah.
But one of the things that Alex, who I know you're friends with, one of the things he talked about in that discussion was this idea that most people are going to come to faith through experience, that these arguments, he very thoughtfully and kindly, but he kind of downplayed the role of arguments and evidence in people's conversion. And so I was curious, the way you present things in the book, what is your take on that, about the importance of arguments versus evidence and so on?
An experience, yeah. I think Alex has a point. And the way I would put it is simply that I don't think anyone ever gets converted on the basis of arguments and evidence alone. But I do think there are plenty of people out there for whom, even if they've had an experience, something that they feel kind of is compelling them towards faith or Christianity, there's still plenty of people out there who will want answers to some of their natural questions and doubts that come, or that they've simply been fed by the culture that they live in. So I think it is actually really important for even for people who may kind of, their first kind of draw towards faith is experiential in some way. They're still going to have plenty of questions and need to kind of settle some things before they feel like, okay, this kind of makes sense both in the heart and in the head. So I would say that, you know, for any thinking person, that's going to be part of the deal. I think there are some people for whom the argument, the evidence is a really significant part, you know, perhaps the major part of their conversion. To some extent, you know, C.S. Lewis's journey was an intellectual journey at one level, because it was sort of an intellectual argument effectively that convinced him that there was a God, that God existed. But the bit that kind of took him across the line to Christianity per se was more that sort of famous, you know, conversation he had with J.R.R. Tolkien, which was all about whether he could marry the imaginative side of his personality, the bit that loved the Norse gods and the mythology of, you know, the ancient world and all of that, the stuff that, you know, the poetry and everything else that stirred his soul, whether that made sense in the fact that, you know, he saw kind of lots of accounts of dying and rising gods in all of that mythology and literature. And it was, of course, Tolkien saying, well, what if the Jesus story is the true myth, the time when it really did happen, and all those are kind of reflections before and after, you know, that story. And that gave him like the permission to see that actually this could be true. And so for me, even in some of our greatest stories of conversion, like C.S. Lewis, there was always this sort of imaginative, experiential element. But it's almost like you kind of need to pair it with the intellectual side of your personality for it all to come into focus and to make sense. And so I think, while I agree with Alex that for a lot of people, there's going to be a sort of an experiential element to their faith, for most thinking people, they also need to put it together with the argument. And it's often, yes, that one will come before the other, but very rarely is there never kind of something of that argument and intellectual sort of search going on at the same time.
Yeah, and I think your book really illustrates that balance that you're talking about, because you talk about how there was this, the new atheism kind of left this void of meaning, right? And so people were searching for meaning, but then that it was also this renaissance, if you will, of secular thinkers considering Christianity and God was also brought about by evidence. And so it's a both and, right? It's not an either or. So that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that's one of the things that apologetics could do better. I think I talk about the left and right brain in the book, and particularly there's a neuroscientist that I've been able to speak to, Ian McGilchrist, who's really written at length about this in a book, The Master and His Emissary. But we to put it in very crude terms, the left brain is kind of the analytical, logical, break everything down to its constituent parts bit of our sort of side of the way we think, and the right side of the brain is the bit that does the big picture thinking, the imaginative, artistic, that kind of stuff. And the problem is we often do approach apologetics in a purely left-brained way, where we think, well, as long as I just give people the facts and the evidence and the logic, that will convince them. But actually, people are far more of a combination of their left and right brain. And in fact, the right brain is usually the thing that's sort of ultimately deciding where they're going to go, because that controls our kind of the way we see things fit together, the sort of the bigger picture. And I think that's where sometimes apologetics needs to start, is actually with that kind of imaginative side of us. Because it's as Blaise Pascal said, you know, make religion attractive, make good men wish that it were true, and then show them that it is. I think you have to help people want it to be true. You've got to inspire their imagination with why this story could be the most meaningful thing in the world. And then they might be open to actually listening to your argument for the resurrection or for the existence of God, because it will speak to their heart in a way it wouldn't just if it was sort of, you know, just a sort of abstract argument for God or Christianity. So I think the church needs to kind of be doing both, but probably needs to start more often with the imagination before bringing in the apologetics kind of to sort of do the second part of that sort of journey, if you know what I mean.
Yes, that's good.
In one of your chapters there towards the end, you start off by saying, I believe we're all made to worship. That instinct runs so deep within us that if we don't worship God, we will end up worshiping something else instead. How do you see that playing out in culture? What sort of examples do you explore there?
G.K. Chesterton had that famous dictum, didn't he, that when people stop believing in Christianity, they don't believe in nothing. They have the capacity to believe in anything. And I think we have seen that. And I think, again, it was, as we were saying earlier, it's what some of these sort of new atheists who have turned to the culture wars have realized as well, is that the void, if you like, the meaning crisis, by the fact that we took away the Christian story, which did give a sense of purpose and meaning and a kind of joint narrative to people's lives, take that away, well, what's going to fill it? Science and reason weren't up to doing the job. That those are kind of very inert, abstract things that people can't build a worldview out of them. And so people have been reaching for all kinds of other stories in our culture. And you can look at some of the things that people tend to treat in a quasi-religious way as good examples of that. So it could be the progressive ideologies that, form a lot of the culture wars, the sort of sexual and gender identities that people treat as sacrosanct, effectively, political, movements, all kinds of social justice issues and everything else. So there's kind of that on the sort of, if you like, progressive left. I think you've got a lot of people telling those stories and putting them in the place of God, putting them sort of, those are the things that they are using to reach for meaning and purpose. But equally, you could look at the sort of the right, the political right, and you see that there are kind of political mythologies that people are using to kind of give themselves a sense of purpose. How many of those people who turned up for the January 6th, storming the Capitol kind of believed that there was, this was the cause that they were made for, that this was, that there was this Messiah-like figure who was going to bring truth and justice and everything else to the world. And the problem is that both of those are stories that people are telling themselves, quasi-religious stories about reality, but that are absolutely unsatisfactory, that will never do the job of filling that God-shaped hole. So for me, it's evidence that people are still religious. It's just they will get religious about different things in the absence of the Christian story. And the question is, how as a church, how as apologists, do we redirect that instinct within them to the Christian story, which so many people seem to think is redundant, pointless, irrelevant. Yet we can see that those other stories are not working for people. All we're doing is driving our culture into the ground with the endless culture wars that these various sort of stories are producing. So that's kind of the stuff I kind of talk about in that chapter and the way that stuff is heading.
Mm-hmm.
One of the points that I really enjoyed, and your answer to that question is a perfect segue here into this question. One of the bits in your book that I really enjoyed was you have a word to the church. So in other words, you speak directly to the church and give some advice to the church about how we should move forward in this current cultural climate. One of the things that really spoke to me is how you talked about even young people are beginning to go to, and I may not be wording this exactly how you did, but more traditional or liturgical churches, if you will, because they don't want to go somewhere where it just looks like the world. So I was wondering, as we kind of begin to land the plane here, what would be some of your advice to the church going forward as we see this kind of, again, this is my word, I guess, renaissance, if you will, in the interest of Christianity?
Well, I think we should be taking the temperature of the culture by looking at what is attracting so many people to the platforms of these interesting intellectual thinkers. Why even if you don't agree with Jordan Peterson's politics, why are so many young men turning up for his YouTube videos, lectures, and everything else? And to ask yourself, what does the church need to be saying to the questions that he is evidently addressing, and so on? Because sometimes we can make the mistake of assuming that the culture is still asking the questions of like 15 or 20 years ago. Basically, when new atheism was riding high, it was kind of a bit easier because it was pretty obvious what the objections were of Hitchens and Harris and co. But I think that times have moved on, and those aren't actually at the forefront now of our culture, those kinds of objections to God. I think people are actually asking themselves these days more kind of existential questions around what's the point of life? How can I get up in the morning? That, we're experiencing this mental health crisis among young people, which I think is fueled by technology, social media, but also this kind of drip of this materialistic story they've been told for so long, coupled with the incredible pressure of the culture they're living in now, where they have to kind of invent their own story from scratch. So I think the church needs to kind of ask itself, okay, what's actually going on? What are the issues that we need to address in this moment and in our culture at this time? And I think the one you mentioned there, Chad, about the church needing to look distinct from the culture is quite important. Mm-hmm. I had this come through from a lot of these secular intellectuals, especially the ones who are sort of attracted to church, the ones who sort of feel like, if they had the right excuse, they might go back to church. But a lot of them said what would not make me want to go back to church is if it just looked like a kind of warmed over version of secular humanism. And I think that sometimes is a problem. In some parts of the mainline church, I think you get churches that are difficult to distinguish from the culture in that way. As in parts of the evangelical church, you get a kind of form of celebrity kind of worship culture, which again is just aping a certain part of popular culture, and I think can be a huge turnoff as well. And obviously we've had some very salient warnings and tragedies really in the church in recent years with the fall of various celebrity pastors and ministry leaders. And like you said, a number of the people I interviewed are actually opting for this more ancient liturgical sort of tradition, people who have become Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Anglo-Catholic. And I'm not saying that's sort of the magic bullet for everyone, because that's not just going to be everyone's cup of tea, but there's something about them stepping into a far more ancient thing, something that looks and feels, weird and different to the rest of culture, because actually they're looking for something weird and different that isn't the same as the rest of the story around them. So I think, so going back to Tom Holland, he said this several times to me, that he finds the secular story of reality really boring. He says it's anemic, it's pallid. He finds the Christian story so much more vibrant and interesting. And he says, but the church so often makes it sound boring and anemic and pallid. And he says, keep it weird, keep Christianity weird, because actually that's what he finds it most exciting.
Yeah, I like that line in the book.
So I think that's something for us to think about. I mean, it doesn't mean that we all troop off to our local, Eastern Orthodox church necessarily, but it might make you think about how your church is actually sometimes becoming irrelevant by trying to be so relevant, if you know what I mean. I think that can sometimes be a problem.
Yeah, I like that. And Apologetics 315 listeners can look up our Make Christianity Weird Again hats at apologetics315.com.
Very good.
Well, on that note, no, Justin, it's a wonderful book. We'll point people to it in the show notes, as well as link to you and your resources online. Anything you want to point people to as we wrap up?
Well, as I say, very soon, probably soon after this podcast goes live, I'm going to be launching a podcast documentary series based on the book. It's going to be a sort of, I don't know if you guys ever listened to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast.
We did.
Yeah. Or the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. It's that kind of format, different content, obviously, but that kind of format. So I'm hoping this will be a really kind of immersive narrative to people to get addicted to and enjoy, and hopefully it'll be very informative and entertaining along the way. So look out for that if you're a podcast listener. But if you want to just keep up with my work, people are very welcome to subscribe to my newsletter at justinbrierley.com. And if you go there, you can also pick up signed copies of the new book as well. Be happy to send those out. So justinbrierley.com is the place.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for being with us again, Justin.
Yes, thank you.
Been great to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
Brian and I are grateful to our listeners. And if you would like to support what we do here on the Apologetics 315 podcast, please consider donating at apologetics315.com/donate. And if you become a reoccurring supporter of our ministry at $10 a month or more, you will receive an exclusive Apologetics 315 t-shirt as a thank you. They are very sought after. We would also greatly appreciate it if you would leave a favorable review of the podcast on iTunes or on the podcast platform of your choice. Again, thank you for listening, and may God richly bless you in Christ Jesus.
Type something, will you? We're paying for this stuff.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Oughton and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.